Let's go ahead and get right back to our guest. Our guest tonight is Dr. Sky, better known as Steve Cates, better known as Dr. Sky. Steve, it's an honor to have you here, my friend.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. It's enjoyable to have this dialogue with you, and I hope we do this again sometime.
Oh, we definitely will do it again. There's so many things to talk about. Let me get a couple questions off to you first, though.
Sure, no problem.
We had several listeners write in some questions, and a couple of them just get your take on it. It says, what was Dr. Sky's most fascinating observation he has made in all his years as an astronomer?
Well, that's a great question. A great audience there, Pat, with some very timely questions. But if I had to pick one of these, I would think that the most phenomenal thing that I've ever witnessed, and folks, stay tuned because you're going to be able to do these things yourself, is witnessing a total solar eclipse. And this happened to me on a number of occasions. You know, going back to my parents, I have to give my father a good shout-out, Bob. Back in 1970, March 7th, I remember it, we lived in New York City. My father said, "Hey, son, how'd you like to go to this eclipse that's visible in Florida?" So a little kid in school, in grammar school, that's a big deal. You know, we went down to Perry, Florida, which is toward the Gulf side of Florida, way up in the north by the Panhandle. And, well, Pat, we never got to see it because it was cloudy and raining at the time of totality. But one of them that I remember, and this is the answer to the great question that your listeners have here. Back in July of 1991, I was fortunate enough to be on the big island of Hawaii, and I witnessed for the first time, thinking back to March 7th of 1970, when it was rainy, I was seeing clouds right outside my hotel as we looked up to Mauna Kea, the big mountain. And a lot of my friends said this, we're going to go up to the top of the mountain because we know we're going to punch through the clouds. Well, unbeknownst to them, they went that route, but they had closed off the roads, and the people who went to the eclipse there, they got stuck in the cloud layer. They saw nothing. I stepped out of my patio at the hotel, and this is the answer to the great question, Pat. And I don't know if you've seen one, but you have to see a total solar eclipse. In the early morning, when this happened, we see this dark shadow cone literally coming racing across the Pacific Ocean, which we could see the ocean on one side and the mountain on the other. This wall of darkness is just coming at you, and that's when, of course, the little sliver of sunlight is still there, and this amazing thing happens. Blacker than black, like inky jet black, is the moon. And right around the edge of the moon are the solar red prominences that are they're not flames, but they're gigantic, plasma fields around the sun.
Right.
And you get to see the corona of the sun, this like iridescent pearl white. Pat, this is incredible. So that's my answer, seeing a total solar eclipse. And we get to see one, folks, jot this down, in August of 2017. We get to be right in the path, meaning across the United States. I believe it starts in Oregon, and it races across the mid part of America like Nebraska and then winds up near South Carolina at the end of the day. I believe it's August the 21st. I'm not looking at any books here to know the exact, but I think that's the date, August the 21st of 2017. And, folks, take a look at that if you haven't seen it. Now, have you seen one of these, Pat?
I have not. Years ago, no, I haven't. I've seen them on, on video and replays and stuff like that, but never saw one for sure.
Totally incredible.
Exactly. Never saw one live. You want to take a call?
Sure.
All right. Let's get a call on. Caller, good morning. Welcome to K-Talk. You're on with Steve.
Yeah, very interesting show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to mention this eclipse also that's coming up, which I believe will actually pass over part of Idaho.
Now, you're referring to the solar eclipse? Or
yeah.
Absolutely, sir. I mean, I don't have an access to the computer right here, but maybe Mark does at the studio.
So only a few hundred miles from here, I'm going to be there.
Oh, you are? Well, see, that's awesome because, again, here's my suggestion for eclipse watchers. I've gone to other eclipses like this where we saw nothing like the one we saw in Hawaii, but here's what everybody needs to know. You need to be able to be mobile within that, hour or two before the eclipse because we get what we call eclipse fever when the weather changes, and it's a matter of even driving, let's say, 50 miles. Obviously, you can't do that if you're out in the ocean, on a ship. The ship can't move fast enough. But you're so right. I mean, I believe you're correct. I believe it goes over some of the areas of Idaho. But it's a sight that everybody should see. Now, have you ever seen one of those before, sir, or this would be your first?
I've seen partial.
Have you?
This would be the only total. But I'll tell you, years ago, I had a good friend, and we talked about going up to Helena, Montana, because there was a total eclipse that passed over there.
Yes.
And we didn't make the trip, but his sister did.
Yes, and it's amazing. It's just a matter of a few hours difference, or the weather can change in some of these places. And the other thing that people really need to pay attention to is if you go to some of these other countries around the world, I mean, some people, and I use the word crazy, they'll go right into the heart of a war zone just to be, that's how dedicated they are to see totality. But you know what? I'd rather just stay stateside or go as close to myself here instead of, Antarctica would be wonderful, but let's do it so we can at least bring back memories, right, Pat, and tell our family that we were there.
Exactly. What kind of equipment do you recommend, Steve, for people to do this?
Here's the best answer. Always have this, and this is like the simplest thing, and a lot of people forget it. The sunglasses that you buy for eclipses, folks, do not make this mistake. People go, you always know somebody, right, Pat, and the gentleman on the phone who's calling who knows better. But in this case, your eyes are the most sacred thing you have when it comes to obviously seeing an eclipse, but you want to keep them safe. Get the proper eclipse glasses. They cost like $2 a pair. They shield your eyes from the infrared, ultraviolet, and all the dangerous rays. So that you would need. I recommend having a camera that also has a solar filter, but you have to test this all out beforehand. And now everybody and their brother and sister is now a digital photography artist.
Right.
Just have a solar filter. If you have a pair of binoculars, obviously don't stare at the sun, but if you mount them on a tripod and then look for the shadow, the least amount of shadow, not looking through them, and then put some solar filters over the binoculars, you might, if you do it carefully, if the filters are on securely, have a chance to view that. But telephoto lenses, filters, a good tripod, extra SD cards or whatever your medium is for these digital cameras nowadays. And I would think a lot of patience, because a lot of people get very frustrated and they go, I want to see totality. It's a matter, folks, of being just about a few miles off that center line, and it goes from being a total eclipse to where if you're not exactly there in the center line, you could see what's called as a hybrid eclipse, where it goes in and out and never is total, and that won't get you to see all the beauty of a total eclipse.
Very interesting. And then I'm sure, just like when we were a kid, every now and then, you try to hold your eyes open for a second or two and take
Yeah, you do. And, I used to get scared by people back in New York. We used to belong to the Hayden Planetarium, which was then like one of the great, locations, just like in Chicago, where you go down, of course, to the museum there. What's that, the Field Museum?
Museum of Science and Industry.
Right, and you get these planetariums. But here's what I wanted to pass on to the listeners, that even in those places, they're describing, all these things that you can see in the sky. But somebody had told me a crazy eclipse story, and I think they were scaring us. But here's the story I heard. A person went to an eclipse. They were watching it, and they stared up at the sun when it was partial, and they really knew they shouldn't do it, but they were now seeing clouds come by, and they thought it was safe, and they had retinal damage, permanent retinal damage, where they burned crescents into their eyes, so they always, Pat, saw the eclipse forever. So whether that's a wives' tale or some old fictional story, protect your eyes. They're only $2, and they're the greatest investment you can make, because you can stand there with those, and I do it weekly when we talk about sunspots on the sun. Right. We're in that max period now. You can see with the little solar glasses, the sun looks the size of a full moon. You can actually see some of the sunspots with the naked eye sometimes. It's pretty cool. Interesting.
You have any other questions for Dr. Sky?
Yeah, let me make a comment and then a question, if I might.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, this girl that did see this eclipse came back, told us all about it, and the thing that really stuck out to me was, I guess she was in an elevated spot overlooking a valley.
Right.
And she said you could literally see the shadow race across the valley.
You could, absolutely.
And another thing I'm wondering about, and I've heard about this, and of course I've seen films of eclipses, but it can't be the same thing. But I imagine this would be an extremely profound, I want to say spiritual experience, but something that really shakes you to the core. Am I right? And would you describe that?
Well, you're right. I mean, there's a very spiritual side to all of this. That's why, when I look at the sky, as I've mentioned to Pat, I have this most amazing feeling of smallness of myself. I mean, we're not that important, folks. And, Pat, I know you and I and our callers would agree on this. The universe is so vast that no matter what we believe in, whatever religion or spirituality we have, but to me, just looking out at the nighttime sky just makes me think, wow, how tiny we are. Carl Sagan, who's a gentleman that I had got to know when I was back in New York State, I visited him many, many times at Cornell University, and I always use this on my radio shows. I usually say, you're listening to this show, and Carl Sagan said that we are the pale blue dot, and literally that's right. We're a tiny marble in a giant universe. But back to the spirituality, when you see the forces of nature come together like that, let's talk, Pat, and let's just take a moment and talk about the uniqueness of the eclipses. The sun, 865,000 miles across. We all know from grammar school, 93-ish million miles away. The moon, 240, 250,000 miles away. A tiny little object, 2,100 miles across, let's say. What's the chances of those two objects in space moving around us, as we move around them, that every so often the geometry of these two things literally make eclipses like a perfect covering of those objects? That is totally unique. It's like a sacred geometry. It's so unusual. It's just exhilarating. And whenever I see one of these, well, it's just exactly how I feel. I feel like it's another spiritual moment, and it's something that people should see. But here's the dark side of eclipses, literally, no pun intended, Pat. It costs a hell of a lot of money to get to most of them.
Right.
You have to prepare. I mean, cruise ships are great, but remember, if the cruise ship is not in the right place, it's not a hydrofoil, and it's not going to fly across the ocean. It's going to be luck. But for our eclipse coming up, and I haven't checked the exact date, I believe that's correct, sir. I believe it's August the 21st of 2017. Get ready now, because that is probably one of the last major eclipses total that we're going to see, in probably our lifetimes, unless we have to travel.
Yeah, I think it would be a great opportunity, and I want to make every effort to see it.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you also, how many have you seen?
Well, total eclipses, I've gone to one. Let's see, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. 2, 3 for me, and 2 of them were washed out. Another one I mentioned back in Perry, Florida, on March 7th. That's an exact date, 1970. And then there's one that I remember back in 1979 up in the Pacific Northwest, also was clouded. But the one in Hawaii was just absolutely spectacular. And that's something I'll never forget. I actually, Pat, have a 8mm video. I guess, what did they have? High 8 or something in those days.
Right.
Somewhere in my collection, and it's a dust collection here in my little studio, I've got it, but it's something that is just amazing. And then I remember a local radio station there in Hawaii playing the war, playing this thing with Slipping into Darkness. It was so apropos, don't you think?
Exactly.
It was amazing. So don't miss it.
All right. Hey, thanks for the call.
Listen, thanks for the time and the information.
Well, thank you.
Take care. Have a good night now.
You too.
All right, bye-bye.
Right.
All right, Steve, we got another one for you, all right?
Yes, sir.
All right, caller, good evening. Welcome to K-Talk. You're on with Dr. Sky.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Sky, I was wondering, I'm building a little place underneath the ground about halfway under for food storage. Mm-hmm. We have a garden, and I like to go get that in the wintertime and eat it right out of the... if I use that for... if there was something coming from the sun and I wanted to escape it, how much dirt would I have over the top of that to protect one? And there isn't a whole heck of a lot that's going to hurt you.
Well, there's not a whole heck of a lot anybody can really do, and I think you're referring to what, solar flares or anything like that out in the open? Well, let's discuss what they are, Pat, and I appreciate your caller describing what could happen and asking questions about it. There isn't a whole heck of a lot that any of us could do if we have a super flare. Back in 1859, this thing called the Carrington event, an astronomer with the last name Carrington witnessed with his naked eye, as he was observing the sun, this most amazing flare that occurred on the sun. And we were literally like a shotgun blast right down the target range. We got hit not only hours, but days later. Telegraph lines, literally went on fire, as the descriptions were. But with these kind of induction events that we get with radiation, there really isn't a whole lot that any of us can do. And that's really the best answer I can give anybody. I mean, unless you put your house into something called like a Faraday cage, and what's that? Like this giant metal enclosure, which would probably cost more than a house itself. I don't really think there's too much that we can do to prepare for what Mother Nature has in store for us. And lucky for us, and I say this very proudly, Pat, this solar cycle, and the gentleman calling, has been extremely weak in comparison to what we experienced about 11 or 12 years ago. So, goodness, it's...
Is it the gamma rays that we'd be shielding? What? Is it the protons or the gamma rays? Or
no, you're correct, sir. It's the proton energies from the sun. What they do is literally they're going to slam into anything that's electronic. They're going to either overload the circuits because it's going to induct all those protons into, let's say, like a magnet. It's going to induct everything.
You can't protect yourself from gamma rays, can you?
Not that I know of. I mean, I'm not really the physicist on that, and I really, to be honest, and it's always good to be honest, I'm really not qualified to answer that. But I would imagine that anything in the universe that we really have to worry about, and this I tell everybody when they're out in our public shows,
getting back to that food,
the biggest blasts are gamma rays, and they're most dangerous.
My friend across the street grows a garden, and he goes out and picks carrots at Christmas time.
Really?
Right out of the garden. He covers it with a straw, and then he just gets them whenever he wants them. But I like to put them in a little container. And if there was a blast from the sun, I would like my grandkiddies to go in there. Hey, when was this man that was on me before me said he was going to go to the one in Montana? What year was that? You remember?
I believe, sir, and again, I'm not looking at any
80s?
Computer. This was a 1979 eclipse that I believe took place, and I think, Pat, you can almost quote me on the month. It was February of 1979 that the people in the states of I got to see that.
I plan to watch this next one.
Don't miss it, because
it's miles away. I actually belong to a hiking group, and one of the guys took off and went to see one of them. I guess it was 15 or 20 years ago, and it was seemed like it was in Central or South America, and he brought back a film to show this 10-minute film, and it was interesting, but he said it's about 5% as exciting as actually being there. I mean, the feeling is just out of this world.
Well, sir, don't leave us. And, Pat, if I can mention one more thing.
Go ahead.
Let me get everybody excited about something that you're going to see here coming up very shortly. Mark this date down, sir, and Pat, this is important. The night of April the 14th.
Okay.
We are going to see the first of a series of total lunar eclipses. We're going to have about 4 of these back-to-back over the course of, months in the next couple of years. But the big one, again, on that night of April the 14th, you can, you can check. People can email me. I'll give my email at the end, of course, if they want more specifics. But just know, in the late night, as it goes to 11 o'clock, midnight, into the 15th, we here, you in Utah, we along this specific western United States, will get to see this magnificent eclipse, totally safe to view. It's the diametric opposite of the solar eclipse. In this case, we have the moon with the Earth blocking the light that it gets, as opposed to the moon coming in front of the sun and then causing that little shadow effect. So make sure, folks, if you want to or haven't seen one of these, we haven't had one of these in over 857 days since the date that we're talking about, the night of April 14th into the 15th. It's going to be spectacular.
Thanks very much for taking my call, Pat.
Thank you, sir. What is your name? I'm sorry.
All right. He hung up on us, Steve. We didn't catch him. Another question that came in is, as far as telescopes go, if a person wants to purchase a telescope,
sure,
and doesn't have a big budget, what is a decent telescope that somebody can buy if they want, a little bit better? That I know I personally think the binoculars. I just remember from years ago, I got so frustrated with the telescope, and I still have it, is, putting it up on the roof of the car and trying to look at the moon and my eye watering and stuff like that, and turning knobs and buttons to the point where you just want to throw it in the trash can.
I know the feeling.
So I've gone to the binocular, but what do you suggest is a good entry-level telescope?
Great question, and you're going to be amazed. I mean, big folks may be amazed at my answer. A lot of times if you go down to your Goodwill, I'm serious, you're going to find the very same phenomenon. I call it the in-the-closet, I forgot about it syndrome. A lot of times, families are just going to clean out the closet, and you'll find one at a steal. I happened to come across a telescope like that literally at a Goodwill, asked them what they wanted for it, and they said to me, let's say $50. The item was worth, in my opinion, knowing telescopes, about $300 or $400, and they said, today, that has a red sticker on it, so it's another 25% off. So that was great. But if you're looking to just purchase new, I suggest this. Shop on the Internet. And I can tell you right now that if you're going to spend you'll probably want to spend about $250 to $300, you can get a lot of good telescopes. The two major manufacturers that people are all going to see are Meade and the company called Celestron. Both make excellent telescopes. But my suggestion, and this is interesting because there's 2 or 3 different type of telescopes. The most basic is the refractor. The clear lens is way up in the front. This is the telescope that we remember in these sci-fi movies with the guy with the balding head, the beard, and the lab coat. And they have the long telescope, and you look at the end, and you focus it. That's a refractor. A reflector is going to simply be this. It has an open tube. Light comes in and heat, and the cold air gets in the tube, and the light shines off a mirror. That's a reflecting telescope. And then you have the third one, which is like the hybrid of both a refractor and a reflector. It's something we call a Cassegrain. You'll hear the term Cassegrain. So to start off, these simple little reflectors, Pat, $250 to $300. Now we come to a juncture in the road. My suggestion is be old school. We see so many now. This may shock a lot of people. We see so many of these telescopes today that have this little electronic thing. You just punch the little button and push the button, and the telescope finds the object. Well, that's really cool. But does that telescope have the capability of letting you go into the neutral mode or manual, like if you had a stick-shift car? Can you put the car in neutral? Can you put the telescope in neutral?
Right.
And find things on your own? I've seen, a lot of people take a little exception to my comment here, but you're asking me. I would rather have a telescope that doesn't have any of that electronic stuff on it, because if I'm just pushing buttons, that's cool. But there's no race to do this, right? I mean, if we learn the nighttime sky, the older telescopes come with what's called a German equatorial mount. They have little dials that have numbers on them. And not to sound making this too complicated, I hope. One of them is right ascension, and the other is declination. It's the sky equivalent of latitude and longitude. If you learn how to balance one of those and set it up, it takes time. But doing it the old-fashioned way is sweeping the sky and finding these objects. The telescopes today that have the computers in them, they're kind of cool. But the honest truth is, what do we really learn about how to find anything? I mean, that's maybe skinning it a little too thin here, but what do you think? I mean, it's something that I think if you're going to learn the sky, do it on your own. Find the object. That's the fun of the whole thing. That's the joy that I get of looking and finding something that you found it on your own.
Right. I agree with you, Steve. I think as long as people can have some success with some good equipment,
sure.
And I never thought about that. I never thought about a Goodwill store here in Salt Lake City. We have something known as Deseret Industries. And
I've seen them. I've been in them, and seriously, you can find some amazing deals there. Now, of course, it's what it is. It's sold as is. It may be missing the eyepieces.
Right.
And let's then, if we have a minute, let's talk about that part of the equation, because you mentioned that you had frustration in trying to set it up. Everybody does. I mean, I've had telescopes that literally, they won't perform. Here's what you need to know about the eyepieces. The bigger the amount of glass, in other words, when you hold it and you look at the top of it, the bigger the amount of glass, the lower the power. The tinier the little hole in there, the higher the power. So always remember this rule. Start off with the big, wide glass. That's the eyepiece. That's the low-power eyepiece. You'll find something in a lot of these telescopes that were made, and still today, they're referred to as magnifiers called Barlow lenses. What are they? They're little things that you put on top, put an eyepiece in, and put the Barlow in. It just doubles the power. It's like a telephoto 2x converter. Use the lowest power you can, the widest field, start that way. Then work the focus knob and try to focus the object. Then once you've succeeded with that, go to the next smaller hole eyepiece, and they're measured in millimeters. You'll see one that says 25 millimeters.
Right.
The next one will say 12.5, and the next one might say 6. If you really want to keep your telescope and not throw it over the balcony because you're frustrated, don't start off with the tiny little one, because it's the high power one. And I guarantee you, whether you're young or older, it can be frustrating as all hell.
Right. Exactly. Well, good advice from a guy that knows. It's again, I think, and here too, just to give a plug to them, the Salt Lake, at least here in Utah, we have the Salt Lake Astronomical Society, and 2 days out of the month they do the star parties. They're free. There's one coming up here in April. It's going to be for the locals. It's here at the Harmon's Cougar shopping store, the supermarket, 62nd South and about 48th West. I believe it's on the 15th or 14th of April. I'll have to put it on our website. Yeah, and the club shows up out there. There's no charge. You can go ahead and take a look. But if you don't want to wait for a club meeting or a star party, again, go to Steve's site and take a look. There's so much stuff out there. I see that you have links to different companies for binoculars and stuff.
Well, sure. We're a business. I mean, and we're not here to talk about that part of it, because obviously that would be too self-serving. But in all fairness, talking about the wonders of the nighttime sky,
right?
It's been a lifelong passion for me, and that's what I like to do, Pat. I like to share the astronomy, space, aviation subjects, and weather with people. We're doing some long-form radio shows here. We're on the big KTAR, the News Talk 92.3 here, so if folks go there, you can see that on the front of the website. We're proud of that show. It's produced, with a wonderful gentleman named Mike O'Connor, who, he's a producer to die for, because the guy understands, right? We can take any voice, and, you can run it through all kinds of processors, and, it's not about so many times who's got the best voice or the presentation. It's amazing, don't you think, what they can do with all this software now?
Oh, it is. It is amazing.
So anybody can sound good, is what I'm trying to say. There you go.
It is. Now let's talk a little bit of, just to change it up a little bit. Your program that you do is a Call to Rights Radio.
Well, Pat, I'm glad you got to it, because I'm a constitutional believer, and I don't want to jump too far into the political thing, and you can turn this down anytime you want. But since you asked, I will go in that route. For the last 15 years, I've been doing a show called The Call to Rights on our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Second Amendment rights. And people are probably jumping out of their skin, but wait a minute, maybe not so much in the state of Utah, because, I'm a certified firearm instructor. I'm proud to be a Utah certified instructor, too. Here down in Arizona, I teach the Utah class. But it started off, Pat, with my simple belief in our military. I spent a little time in the Army, didn't do anything important, just did my job. But I always believe, and still believe to this day, that our country is facing some of the most incredible challenges, putting it mildly, in our Constitution, our ability to believe in our religious rights, our ability to be free and individuals. And we all saw what happened during the last election. And what I'm here to tell people is this is the other side of Steve Cates. And it's interesting. I've represented firearm manufacturers for years. I'm a shooter. I'm a trainer. And I also work with Sheriff Joe Arpaio here. Many people know him in his what they call Qualified Armed Posse program. So basically what I do, whenever I have a little time, and there isn't a whole lot of time left, for 15 years I've been a volunteer in this, and you ride second man, and, I'm qualified to ride with the deputy like my brother and a lot of other folks. And that's my way of giving something back to the community. But A Call to Rights is a show that's on our flagship station here. It's KFNX, News Talk Radio, which is an interesting station, 1100 on the AM dial, and people can listen noon on our time, now Pacific time, every Saturday. And we have great guests. And, we've been doing this everywhere from getting senators, congressmen, ex-presidents. This particular Saturday, of all people, we have Marcus Luttrell, the Navy SEAL, who's the namesake of the Lone Survivor movie, coming on. He's doing a big program here in Phoenix. So, Pat, I always believe this. When I'm out in the desert, teaching about the sky, I feel comfortable and confident that if I needed to have a firearm at ready, it's legal.
Right.
I'm not, a lot of people are afraid to go out into the dark. And even here in Arizona, now I'm getting very political on you. There's so many people who do not want to go out into the deserts of Arizona because they're hearing by downstream media, let's say, not shows like yours, but downstream media where they're saying, there's drug traffickers out there and all kinds of problems, and it scares the people from going there. And I'm proud to say I've got my high-powered telescope in the front, and I've got my high-powered rifle in the back. So, for no reason other than we're allowed to have it. That's what the Second Amendment says. So how about this? When's the last time you talked to a science person that's on that side of the equation politically? And you want to know something? It gets me in a little trouble, too, sometimes.
Yeah. Oh, I know. It's, well, and again, it's, with our show, of course, I don't delve too much into politics, although I need to get Jesse Ventura on one of these nights.
Oh, he'll be a good guest. I mean, we've had him before, and, you know, he's an interesting guy, and I think he fits perfectly into the theme of your radio show, the Fringe radio show. That'd be an awesome guest.
Well, something that we're kind of moving to a little bit, not to digress too much, Steve, but something that actually, in going through your website and some of your stuff, I kind of was climbing through some of the stuff. You, with your show and your stuff, you go to what I'll call these prepper things, and that's kind of a direction we're still, the core of our show was built on kind of the paranormal and the ufology and stuff, and I love doing it. We've moved into the science and a lot of different other things, but I also am kind of moving into what I'm going to call fringe living a little bit, and it doesn't mean the person that necessarily when we see shows like Extreme Preppers where it's a little over the top, but just to be a little bit prepared. Here in Utah, we've got we're ready for a major earthquake here. I mean, we're sitting on the tilt of it.
I simply love the people of Utah. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, honestly, of places that I would consider to live, I would certainly want to be your brother and living in one of the beautiful areas when I drive up the I-15. I mean, you know the geography better. But there's a mountain, I think it's called Mount Nebo, that you come up on I-15. And once I start to see that about 60 miles away, I go, wow, I know why people settled in this particular area. And now, do I sound like I'm doing a good job of doing the tourism side of the thing? But no, it's just beautiful. And
it is.
I don't think we have to convince people in your state, the beautiful state of Utah, that, here's the thing about the prepping thing. I've spoken at these prepper events, and people go, well, you're two people. You're Dr. Sky and you're this Call to Rights guy. So I told them, here's a great topic, and they had me speak last Friday at the Big Prepper Fest in Arizona. I talked about electromagnetic pulse, the danger of what it is, and the connection to the solar cycle, but also talked about the political issue of what happens if a rogue nation shoots a Scud missile from a submarine parked off the East Coast or the West Coast. We're sitting ducks, don't you think?
Yeah.
So it's sad. And my buddy Tony Tangelos, who's the head of that Prepper Fest, I like his line. He said, prepping is not for doomsday, it's for every day. And I think, being self-reliant, what was the Boy Scout motto? And it is, always be prepared.
Right. And again, it doesn't mean that we're not looking to go way off the deep end with it, because it's like anything, you can go off the deep end. But to talk about some things to keep people thinking a little bit and keep them moving forward. Is your station down there? Is it an independent station as well, Steve?
It is. It's Independent Talk 1100. That's the exact wording of the station, KFNX, and. If you're interested, I know it's always the death knell of radio shows. You're not supposed to be promoting your show on somebody else's show. But I mean, it's interesting, and I appreciate the open door. It's a conversation, and I love it. But it's calltorights.com if people want to listen to previous guests. And we just had a phenomenal guest, Peter Kiernan, who is a self-made billionaire, who's been a hedge fund, manager, a Wall Street guy, a world traveler. His book, though it sounds a little offensive, the title, I didn't make it up, Becoming China's Bitch, is the bestseller on the New York Times best-selling list. What does it talk about? And this is interesting, and I think it's kind of showing you where my thought pattern is. Extremism in anything is no good, but his book talks about becoming more of a radical centrist. Isn't that an interesting term?
Yeah.
In other words, let's be in the middle on certain issues, because whether we're Republican, whether we're independent, whether we're libertarian, or what have you, or just simply constitutional believing people, and I love that, it's that maybe somehow we all need to, and who am I to tell anybody to do anything, but if you look at this man's book, I mean, he just goes through what I think is such common sense solutions to what he calls 10 problems that we need to avoid, including the namesake of the book.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is stations like KFNX and AM 630, these independents that people don't realize. People here in Utah, they're lucky to have stations like this. When I do this show, when you do yours, are we 100% right? Do we say everything that everybody wants to hear or not hear? But it's the opportunity to do it because the media is really so controlled. It is so controlled.
Oh, boy, are you right on target, because it's voices like yourself, it's voices like myself. Again, there's always better who can do better than both of us in shows. All we are is we're continuing to chip away just relentlessly about these subjects. And it's important to me, Pat, like I believe it is to you, to talk about these kind of subjects because, look what's happening. And again, I don't want to get too far into the political thing. And people can listen to shows like this, like ours and yours. They learn something. And I've described, or people have described, my way of doing this is like NPR for the right side of the brain. So there you go.
Except NPR is so on the left side.
So imagine that, NPR for the right side of the brain. And let me say this, there's not an ounce of hatred to me toward any individual. It's not,
Oh, no.
We're not with the rabbit teeth and, frothing at the mouth. It's let the other side, whatever that side is, I don't care who it is.
Right.
As long as it's done in a civil conversation and people are not breaking the door down at the radio station with pitchforks
Exactly.
and flaming torches, conversation is what we need.
But we don't want to get started on the IRS and stuff like that.
Well, I'll leave that to you because you do the show called the Fringe Radio Show.
Yeah, the Fringe Tax Show.
That's it. And there you go.
Couple other questions that came in for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Let me go ahead and throw these out to you. It says, what is your thoughts about astral binoculars?
Now, I'm trying to understand what the person's astral binoculars?
Yes.
Well, I'm really not sure what they mean by that.
ASTRAL binoculars?
I don't know if that means it's a brand name, but it's nothing. Let me say this. The simple answer is it's not something I know of as any. I mean, I have binoculars of all different shapes and sizes, and I know not one that's called an astral binocular, but if they're referring to, and I can go any which direction with this, if they're referring to, the listener's referring to, what specific binoculars are for astronomy, maybe that's where we're headed with this, I hope. All binoculars obviously can be used for the nighttime sky, but here's a simple trick in binoculars, and maybe this is a good answer to a question that maybe I'm not hearing clearly. Any binoculars you have, the first number on the left, let's say it's 10 by 50. A lot of people don't know this, Pat. 10, the number on the left, is the power, and 50, the number on the right, is the diameter of the lens on the binocular. So there's 25.4 millimeters, we all know from basic grammar school, right, to an inch. So you're looking at a 2-inch, let's say, in diameter piece of glass at the end of the binocular, magnifying 10 times, so 10 by 50. I have some binoculars here that are kind of cool, but they're ridiculously heavy. They weigh about 25 pounds. Get a load of this, they're 30 by 150. So if you really need a tripod to hold those, 7 by 50. 7 power by 50 millimeter. So maybe that's what people are referring to. What binoculars are basically for the night sky. All binoculars can. And when you're buying binoculars, another good tip on this is, believe it or not, even places like Walgreens, they have some imports that are like $10 or $12. Maybe that fits somebody's budget because maybe they're not familiar with this. Why not experiment with the low-end product? They're not as high quality as maybe if you went and bought a Nikon nitrogen-filled binocular. But it's all what you can afford, but learn what these different numbers are. Maybe that's what the question is all about.
Well, you know what I find so interesting, Steve, and I'm sure you do too. Years back, I mean, we're age-wise, we're pretty close to each other, and
sure.
I'm not a hunter, but I am an avid shooter. I'm a long-distance shooter.
I like you already.
I like guns above and beyond everything else from the political side or the constitutional side. Guns are cool.
And so do 99.99% of the people of Utah.
Right. They're cool. They're fun to play with. You've got to take safety and make sure your children can't get to them. And
absolutely.
But, when I look back over the years, I mean, I remember years ago, if you wanted a good set of binoculars, you had to look at, like, Carl Zeiss. You had to look at Zeiss.
You're absolutely right. And some of those, if you can find them.
Right.
Here's a quick story. I found a telescope one time on Craigslist, of all places. And what was it? It was a telescope. By the way, this telescope I'm going to mention is one of the world's most expensive. They're called Questar, Questar. That's the name brand. Right. You can spend $5,000 in buying one Questar. Their little suitcase you could carry around like an attaché case. It's in there. And there's a whole cult following for this. So I didn't have that kind of money. So I watched, like everybody, the photo and camera section of Craigslist, and sometimes you'll find a steal. So I sure did. I found somebody who wanted to sell, and the ad went something like this. College student, inherited this from my grandfather, really not sure how to use it, willing to take like $800 or $900 for this. So, of course, I called, and I burned rubber out of my driveway, I think, to get there, to get to this one. But sure enough, when I got there, it was beautiful. And I didn't, I made another offer like anybody. You don't always pay what anybody's asking. You try to what? You try to negotiate a price. So the person took a little bit less than that, and he said, I'm glad. He goes, I need the money. And I said, well, I tell you, I got this telescope. It's really cool. So you can find some things like that on Craigslist. But like I said, you don't have to have a telescope that's that high dollar. Everything within the $200 to $300 range that you'll find new today from either the people like at Meade or Celestron and other good manufacturers, you're going to find something that you can see things in the sky that you'll be totally amazed with.
Very interesting. Another question for you, Steve, is it says, what are your thoughts on the dwarf star that was recently discovered outside our solar system, and how many are undetected and could possibly have an effect on Earth or nearby planetary bodies?
Well, this is interesting. It goes to a long answer, but in the time we have here, we'll keep it short. In this particular near solar area, our sun, we're 93 million miles away. We know that they took out the planet Pluto. That, by the way, that was my professor in college, the guy who discovered it, Clyde Tombaugh. Now we have 8. Within light-year distances of about maybe 10 light years, we have virtually a little in the way of what's out there. We know there are a few stars, but I think this is what the important part is. We really, really have to start paying attention to understanding, and scientists are on this. The end of stellar evolution is a little thing called a brown dwarf. And this is so amazing because these are stars that are not planets. These are objects that are many more times the size of Jupiter. But they're losing a lot of their mass. They're losing a lot of their temperature. They're about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, if you can believe that, a star that cool. But it's amazing that there's these little objects that are out there. And I have to really, salute the astronomers that have been doing something that many people today, like you talk to young people in school and you make the statement, we have 400 or 500 exoplanets that we know of around stars. Pat, I have to do a double take when I hear that. The first one of these discovered like back in 1995. I remember when I was a young boy, 25 years old, let's say, we didn't even know of any other planetary objects around other stars. So now today it's taken for granted, but the great Kepler telescope, when it was functioning, has identified so many of these what we might consider to be habitable type planets. And the one that the question is referring to is this type of object, these type of objects, these planetary objects that are around nearby stars. It's so amazing. So who are we to think? In this vast, just Milky Way, 250 billion stars, billion, I said. And who are we to think that we're the only life form in there? One of the things that astronomers, I think, are seriously neglecting, and I've talked to a lot of experts on this is where I formulate this opinion. We've had SETI as a project for years to search for extraterrestrial life. I think we're sending the message to the wrong places. And a lot of the astronomers that I've talked to, here's what they say. The preponderance of these small red dwarf stars in our Milky Way galaxy may be the location where these habitable planets really are, and maybe that's the area that we should start sending signals, not to the hotter, larger stars, that most people think, well, they're sun-like. But I find that fascinating, don't you, that with the preponderance of red dwarfs, that might be an area in which we need to look in the sky.
Yeah. I agree. Well, it's and that's kind of a question for you, Steve. When you give your talks and meet different people,
sure.
Of course, like Edgar Mitchell, we were talking a little bit about him earlier. The whole UFO thing, does that come up a lot?
It sure does. And let's go back to Edgar Mitchell
Sure.
for a moment, just like yourself, and that's a guest that you most definitely would want on the Fringe radio show, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy. He goes to the shows that talk more about thinking out of the box. And here's an astronaut of Apollo 14, as he said to me, you know, Dr. Sky, he said, we were one of the last crews on the moon. He and Alan Shepard, you know, the first American in space to go to the moon, and Alan Shepard had all kind of medical issues that they almost scrapped his flight. But here's these two men walking on the surface of the moon. They were the last Apollo landing crew to have to pull the little rickshaw, like the little luggage cart, as I call it, to collect the lunar samples.
Right.
But the story goes that they almost got lost, and they were so overwhelmed trying to reach this cone crater that the blinding light of the sun, they kind of lost a little time and space. But going back to Edgar Mitchell, this is the most amazing astronaut. Why? Because he's been there. It's his only flight into space. Think about how lucky that is. You know, astronauts have been on the shuttle many, many times, and they never got to go to the moon. But here's a man who went, first-time mission, has an not an extraterrestrial, but an out-of-body type of experience, as he describes in his book, which I take totally seriously, A Whole Reawakening, that he's the most amazing man. And when he's at Space Fest and all these different events that we attend, I consider him a friend. And, you know, these are people that are, getting much older. So of the astronauts that walk the moon, I look at Edgar Mitchell as a very unique person because he's responsible, as you probably know, Pat, with this whole development of a thing called the Noetic Institute.
Yes.
Which is thinking about things that are totally out of the realm of reality. Like his big thing is talking and understanding what consciousness really is. Isn't that amazing?
It is. It is.
So, I mean, that could be a show that, you know, that fits, of course, right into your realm more than anybody. And I'm sure he'd be more than happy to come on the show.
Well, and the whole thing with our show, Steve, is it really comes down to it's about being open-minded is really what it is. And, you know, the thing is, people not that many years ago, and I know listeners are probably saying, oh, here he goes again on the same rant, but not that many years ago, some of these subjects that we talk about, if you talked about them, they'd want to put you in the straitjacket. People would lose. I mean, and even today, pilots, they may make comments, but none of them really, and I'm sure you've talked to many, they may say, yeah, we've seen things, but you'll never really hear of too many pilots that are, especially the ones that are, you know, maybe ready to retire, getting a good salary. They're not going to come out and say anything too off the wall. They don't want to endanger themselves. They don't want to lose their job or what have you.
Well, Pat, you're bringing up something good, and I know, you know, time's going to run out here. The sands of time will run out, but I'm hoping that someday, if you're interested, we could do this in a longer format and talk about, this is just whetting the appetite of the listeners, the most amazing story that I've ever heard. I've had the privilege and honor of interviewing some of these abductees, like Barney and Betty Hill, but Betty Hill, of course. Barney had died, and many people know that abduction story with the book that they had written, the book that was written about them. But here, in a nutshell, is still to this day, and I had the captain who wrote this book called Fated Giant. And in the military, a fated giant is when a nuclear weapon system inexplicably goes offline and nobody knows what the reason is. But here's what happened, allegedly. Back, I believe, in the 1960s, 1967, in Maelstrom Air Force Base, a big flight of these Minutemen or missiles in the ground were, how do I say this? They were overcome by this large blue ball of light that purposely went over each of the silos where the Minuteman missiles were and summarily just shut them down. Now, that to me is like totally amazing because what was the blue ball of light? Some say, oh, that was a Russian, you know, that was a Soviet interceptor craft. No, I don't think so. But if you listen to this captain, Captain Silas, I believe his name is, he goes into such detail about a fated giant. They had people come from the manufacturers like Westinghouse and Boeing or whoever put the missiles in the ground. And if I'm correct, according to this captain, and these are his words being repeated by me, and I'm not doing as good a job as he could, inexplicably that weapon system went offline, and to this day, nobody has a concrete answer as to how something that sophisticated, even in the old 60s computers, how could something like that just shut it down and make it inoperable? That's a serious concern. I wonder what it was.
Yeah. I know. Well, and again, you have a lot of, just like you mentioned about Edgar Mitchell, you know, stepping forward and, again, someone who has got such his career and everything that he's done. I mean, people look up to him. I think it's great that people like himself come out and
it's amazing.
They're not afraid to talk about these things.
But Pat, in the few minutes that we have, and maybe this is a subject for a future show, if you so choose to do that.
Oh, you definitely will be back as long
as
we would. I mean, we haven't even scratched the
surface.
surface.
Here's one that I think the listeners would hopefully like to at least I would like them to think about this. I was fortunate enough to attend the last launch of the shuttle back in 2011. Mm-hmm. If I said 1911, they'd know I'm telling them the half truth.
That's a pistol, Steve. Sorry.
So I went to see this, and a lot of people were in the press pool. We're standing there with Vic Ratner of ABC News and all these other cool people, and we're just shooting pictures. That was the most amazing thing I ever saw. But here's the point that I'm trying to make: what the heck happened to the American space program?
Yeah.
And that is something that really needs to be talked about. There's many, many theories. And, again, I'm not pointing the finger at any one person. I'm not going to say it's Obama's fault alone. I'm not going to say it's the head of NASA's fault. It's not the government. It's just that what the heck has happened to America's future in space? And thank goodness people like Elon Musk of all these companies that are going to space, we're seeing a privatized space effort in this country. But not quick enough. But yet, if you talk to the people at SpaceX, you got to salute them. I think they're doing a heck of a job, and they really have it right as far as what's happening. But where does that lead the government? Should the government be involved in the space business? And maybe things need to change, but we need to get back to space. I'm a firm believer of that, and I knew you would probably think I would be.
Well, I think, we've had different guests on from JPL and associated with JPL and different professors. I kind of think NASA is just such a big machine as far as money and what it costs.
Sure, I mean, they do a lot of good, but
they do.
What are we doing now to do with what money we have?
But again, I'm glad to see people like Burt Rutan and even Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic, and of course Elon Musk and some other smaller ones that are coming up now. I think Elon Musk may put a man on Mars before anybody else does. I mean, they're going to start using their capsule to go to the ISS
in a Tesla vehicle, right? Driving on Mars.
Exactly, very soon. Steve, we got to wrap it up for the night. For our listeners that if they want to check out your sites, just go to drsky.com. And now your radio show. When is your radio show on again?
Again, noontime Pacific time now, here on Saturdays for 2 hours. It's at calltorights.com.
Okay.
And if you want to check out, of course, our photo site for the aviation side, it's photorecon.net. And I appreciate you having me here, Pat, on the Fringe radio show. And I always like to end shows by saying this, and it's pretty simple. It's in my blood. Always remember to keep your eyes to the skies.
Exactly. Steve, it was an honor to have you here. We will stay in touch.
Thank you.
We'll get that book to you, and we'll get you back on real soon.
Thank you so much, Pat. I appreciate that, and I want to say good night and good morning to all the listeners. Thank you.
All right. Take care, Steve. Good night. Thank you again so much. Bye-bye. All right. Steve Katz, Dr. Sky. Go check out his website. There are so many interesting links there. It is unbelievable.